Welcome to Investor in the Family Radio, a podcast dedicated to helping you make better investments in less time so you can live more life. My name is Brian Bain and I'm your host. You can find more shows and other valuable content at investorinthefamily.com. Well, hey, Mark, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Hey, absolutely. Looking forward to it. Mark, it's always great to have conversations with you about technology and everything else, stock market. And you actually wrote an article recently on Apple, as you often do, but this one was titled Apple, A New Growth Era. And I'm really excited to hear more about your thesis here and ask some questions, as obviously Apple is a stock that many people are interested in, myself included. And it's kind of hard to avoid information and news about Apple, so being able to get a little more insight is always fun. So could you maybe kick us off by telling us a little bit about kind of the general idea behind that article, and we can kind of take it from there?
Well, I think I'm in the article. I basically kind of concede that, maybe iPhone unit growth isn't happening anymore. And just, investors should resign themselves to the fact that, iPhone's still selling really, really well every quarter, but the dramatic growth that we saw, say in 2015, it just isn't really happening anymore. The market is kind of saturated, and Apple isn't really gaining much in the way of market share on a unit basis. So the things that are going to drive Apple's growth going forward are going to be things like services. It's going to be other devices, especially wearables, Apple Watch, probably Apple smart glasses that will be their big augmented reality platform, and to some degree increasing ASPs for the iPhone. Now, I've heard people say, well, they can't just keep jacking up the price of iPhone forever. Well, they don't do that. That's not what's going on. When the average selling price increases, it's because they're actually building in more value to the iPhone. For instance, iPhone 10 was a very expensive iPhone, but it was also the first iPhone with a really, really great OLED display. And it was also the first smartphone, period, that had a 3D sensor and what Apple calls Face ID. So, Apple was building in new features. They weren't just jacking up the price. People have said, well, they can't keep doing that forever. Well, I think they're pretty creative insofar as introducing new features, new technologies into their iOS products in order to increase the value. And as they increase the value, the prices will go up.
Quick question on that is, do you have much info as far as has their cost increased very much as the prices increased, or have they been able to keep their cost pretty consistent?
Well, I think their cost certainly has increased. It's very difficult to know for sure what their gross margin is for a specific device model, because they don't release that information. They only release gross margin at the corporate level. Now, I believe on the last earnings call, they said they were going to start reporting gross margin for devices overall. At the same time, they're going to stop reporting unit shipments for devices. So I don't know how much real value there's going to be in that.
Yeah, I was just curious if there's much info there, because obviously if there's more value in the iPhone and the price is going up, I'm just curious how much of that they're capturing in margin.
Yeah, I've heard different takes. Some people are claiming that their margins are going down. Some people are claiming their margins are staying constant. I think their operating margin overall corporate wide has gone down over the years. I always felt it should go down because they were already so profitable that reducing their operating margin was in effect a way to sort of give back to the consumer, because they didn't have to keep making billions upon billions of dollars every quarter, that they could afford to run with somewhat lower operating margins effectively. That amounts to a somewhat lower price than they might have charged if they'd maintained a constant operating margin.
It is definitely a strange scenario to be in when you're literally making way more money than you know what to do with.
Well, and they've been for quite some time, especially when it was all locked up overseas and they had no way to repatriate it. According to the new tax scheme, it's called deemed repatriation. So whether they bring it to the United States or they leave it in some bank in Luxembourg or Ireland or wherever it's cashed, it doesn't matter. As far as the IRS is concerned, it's deemed repatriated and they tax it anyway.
Oh, well, at least you get that out of the way, right? So in the future, you can do what you want.
Yeah, different companies handled that differently. Some took the deemed repatriation tax bill as a lump sum in one quarter. Apparently, Apple's kind of spreading that out over multiple quarters.
I can imagine that's a pretty big bill. Okay, I got us off track a little bit. Let's go back to you. You mentioned you're talking about what's going to drive Apple's growth going forward. You mentioned services, other devices, wearables, and then we talked for a minute about raising the average selling price or the ASP for the iPhone and whether or not they can keep doing that. And as long as the value keeps increasing, then the price will probably increase as well. And that's kind of where I veered us off a little bit. You had mentioned, before I interrupted and asked my question, you talked about, what's going to drive Apple's growth going forward. It's going to be services, other devices, wearables, watch, smart glasses. But specifically, we talked briefly about raising the average selling price, the ASP for the iPhone. And,
right.
As long as they're increasing value, they should be able to keep increasing the price. But then I kind of took us off there.
To some degree, yeah. Those are, I think, the principal growth drivers. I'm not ruling out that there might be a future expansion in iOS devices. But I think insofar as what we analysts can see going on for the next few years, services, wearables, and iPhone, and to some degree iPad ASP are going to be the sources of growth in terms of top line revenue, and I'm fine with that. I especially since what Apple did this past quarter was actually pretty impressive. They managed roughly 20% year-over-year growth in revenue for their for the calendar Q3, Apple's fiscal Q4. They because they've been buying shares, they actually got a 40% year-over-year growth in EPS. So they're doing well just on that basis, and I think people may not realize just how well the wearables category is doing. It grew 30% year over year, and so that's mostly Watch and AirPods right now. That's really just those two products, and probably Watch is accounting for about 80% of that revenue growth. And then services is also doing really, really well, and I think Apple's got a tremendous sort of captive market of device users, Apple device users, that they can sell services to, and they're doing that. And so they are transitioning to a more services oriented company. They're transitioning to a greater amount of diversity, even though they're still very dependent on iPhone. And I expect that trend to continue.
Well, tell me this. And I had a conversation recently with someone else talking through Apple and some of these dynamics, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as far as, so right now the market's obviously, they've been a little upset with Apple.
The market has been upset with virtually every technology company that does substantial business in China or has substantial production in China. That has been sort of the unifying features for the various technology companies that have suffered during this past earnings season.
And that's fair. And that's fair. And won't deny that at all. But obviously, another thing that's been mentioned about Apple specifically is what you've already said. Well, hey, if Apple is really the iPhone company and unit sales on an iPhone is flattening off or leveling off and looking to be flat ongoing, people are just worried, okay, well, the iPhone company, is plateauing on how many iPhones they can sell. And assuming that thesis, and it sounds like, it's from our view, it looks like that's probably the case.
Yeah.
Does the does the current or projected growth in wearables and services, is it enough to compensate for that flatlining in iPhone unit sales?
I believe so. Yeah, it really, I am still assuming that there's going to be some ASP growth in iOS devices, and possibly some unit growth, especially in the iPad category. They just introduced a new set of iPad Pros. They're becoming very, very powerful machines. But I think if Apple really wants to sort of break out of this rut that iOS is in, because I think I pointed out that if you look at iOS devices in aggregate, which is iPhone, iPad, and even a few of the old iPod Touches that they happen to still be selling, they've been in this plateau now for several years, and so there's nothing really new there if you look at both devices, iPhone and iPad. They're coming to sort of a critical juncture where they need to decide what to do with iOS, because iOS is definitely holding back the platform. The processor has a lot of excess power. When Apple showed off the new iPad Pros at the October event, they were bragging about the fact that they're as powerful as some of the most powerful mobile Intel processors that they have in their own Mac notebooks. So it's getting to the point now where I think iOS is really not fulfilling the potential of the hardware platform.
So the operating system software is really limiting what the hardware can do.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
And so, I think they need to make some decisions there, and it's not clear how they're going to go, because they're still very fixated on keeping the macOS platform and the iOS platform separate. And iOS platform only does touch and doesn't use a mouse or a keyboard, it uses a keyboard, but it doesn't use a mouse or a trackpad. And Mac doesn't use a touchscreen, and never the twain shall meet. And they have this. They're really hung up on this whole convergence thing, which they've dissed numerous times. Microsoft for converging mobile and PC devices in Windows 10. They've said that isn't the right answer. But at the same time, they're constraining iOS to be to the platform that it was when basically iPhone was first introduced as a touchscreen based device, way back when in 2007, and the processor was much less powerful than it is now. So somehow they need to decide what to do, and there's a number of things that they could do. One thing they could do to sort of beef up Mac sales I think it would help Mac sales, is to go ahead and switch their Mac laptops to their own custom designed ARM processors and essentially port Mac OS to ARM. Microsoft is already doing that with Windows 10. They have a Windows 10 version on ARM laptops. Those ARM processors are being supplied by Qualcomm. So there's precedence there. I think Apple.
So just pause real quick. So help me understand how that would improve things. So if Mac sales, like the laptop or the desktop computers, could improve if they switched the laptops to their ARM. So now, if the processors in the Macs changed, that would improve sales. Can you help me with that a little bit?
Yeah, right. The reason is that with the ARM processors that they are, say, using in their iPad Pros, they can make the Macs much thinner, much lighter, and with much better battery life than they can currently with the Intel processors.
Okay.
The ARM processors seem to be, there's a longstanding controversy about this, but the ARM processors seem to be inherently more energy efficient.
Okay.
Certainly, when you compare what Apple is currently using in the MacBooks for Intel processors versus what they're using in iPad Pro, it's certainly true that Apple's custom designed ARM processor is much more efficient, much more energy efficient.
So that would help the MacBook, like MacBooks, MacBook Pros, because then they'd be lighter, thinner, better batteries, and they'd be able to compete more effectively against competition laptops.
Yeah, and actually one of the chief advantages, perhaps the most important advantage, is that the processor itself would be much less expensive than what they have to pay Intel.
Interesting.
And they don't have to give Intel profit.
Yeah.
For if they use their own custom design processor. So there's a lot of reasons for doing that for Mac, and I think by and large right now people are sort of convinced that they're going to do that at some point, and it's just a matter of time.
So for Apple growth, that's one thing that can be done. They can change the processors in the MacBooks, which would improve them the ways we already talked about. And
yeah, I mean, after all, the laptop market is still a huge market, and Apple doesn't have that big a market share. So growing market share in the laptop market could definitely provide some growth for them.
Yeah. Okay, I'm taking notes. I'm here.
Yeah. Now the other thing that they could do is if they don't want to boost the Mac, and there's some argument that maybe they want the Mac to just sort of wither and go away because it's not as profitable a platform as iOS. Okay, part of the reason is that the Mac apps aren't exclusively required to be passed through the Mac App Store. There is a Mac App Store, but there's still plenty of developers who just ignore the App Store.
Right.
That's a nice profit center, the App Store for Apple, whether it's iOS or Mac. So the counter argument is we just let Mac sort of wither away and we just focus on the really profitable platform, which is iOS. But if they do that, then they've got to do something about iOS to make it truly something that can be a PC replacement, because it isn't that right now.
And so, one of the big things holding back iOS is iOS is just currently what what do you feel like needs to change from a software perspective to unlock the potential that's there in the hardware?
Well, it's actually pretty simple, but Apple just hasn't been willing to do it. I saw this article recently in Apple Insider, which I usually glance at every morning among all the other websites that I look at every morning. And the article was listing the 5 things that are wrong with the new iPad Pro. Now, this is kind of a revelation right there, because normally these kinds of Apple fan sites don't get critical like that. And one of the chief criticisms in the article was no mouse or trackpad support.
Interesting.
And you might wonder, well, why is that so important? Well, it has to do with being able to use an external monitor. If you think about how you use a standard PC desktop monitor, you're looking at the monitor and you're moving the cursor around with a mouse or a trackpad. And you don't have to look at the mouse or the trackpad because you can see where you're moving on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that in iOS.
Because you can only, iOS, you have to use your finger for everything.
You have to use your finger, but more importantly, there's nothing on, that you can connect an iPad or an iPhone to an external monitor, but you can't see where your finger is pointing on the external monitor because there's no visual feedback. So you have to look down at the device, which makes the external monitor almost useless. It's really only good for presentations when you want to, show what you're doing.
So if I'm holding an iPad or an iPhone and I want to connect to an external monitor, say a TV screen up on a wall, And if I want to control that, oh, I see. So yeah, normally, okay, yeah. So if I'm wanting to work on that, I've got to keep looking down at my iPad to do something and then look back up at the monitor back down, as opposed to a mouse where it's more intuitive. You can just move it back and forth and see the mouse. There's basically there's no cursor.
Yeah, there's no cursor.
That's the issue. There's no cursor.
And that's the thing that, Android has supported since time immemorial. Okay. But Apple has refused to go there because, once again, it's this convergence issue.
Yeah, it is fascinating, from Android products or Microsoft products. There definitely tends to be, it's this feel of, hey, we're taking the computer and putting it up onto a phone or a smaller device, and all the different features that you'd have on a PC or a traditional laptop. You can add more storage if you want to. There's all these different little bells and whistles they're happy to add on, but Apple's been so focused on the clean, purity of design in terms of function and actual look. They've had that idea of, hey, this is something separate and different. And I guess convergence, like you're describing, it's just not, they don't want to cross those paths. And they've made obviously they made some adjustments and stuff, but it is interesting. And just even the language that you said they used earlier of like making fun of Microsoft for their approach, because it's saying that we don't think that's the right solution, which is fascinating to even for these companies to be in a situation where it makes sense, but it's crazy to think about it this way, that they're in positions to they're deciding what the best solutions are for the devices that we use in every single part of our lives. And they're saying, you know what, that's not the best way to do it, it's just the way it is. It's just fascinating to think about.
It's a longstanding complaint I have about Apple, that they get sort of wrapped around the axle with these very dogmatic ideas that they have about what constitutes the best device or the best user experience. And eventually they change, but it takes them a long time. For instance, for a long time, they were saying that the iPhone 5 was the optimal screen size.
Right.
And they resisted going to large screens for a long time.
Yeah. Fortunately, they got over that.
Yeah. Eventually they got over it. Right. And I think, so it's those kinds of sort of internal, revelatory catalysts that can really be significant drivers for growth for them. When they did finally get past the large screen size and produce iPhone 6, man, that thing was a huge hit.
Was that 2015?
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Well, and there's just, of course, not to get too philosophical, but you have to be a little bit with this stuff, because you think about when it comes to growth for Apple. We mentioned, basically Apple, the iPhone company, the huge driver, and that's the reason why, what happens with iPhone is going to be one of the biggest drivers of the stock price currently and going forward for at least the foreseeable future. And, services are growing, wearables are growing, but those are still all peripheral to the phone, which reinforces the point all the more. And, for the longest, and it's just interesting to think about, because any other thing Apple can do right now is still a peripheral service or device that still feeds off the iPhone, except for some of the changes you mentioned, the Mac. And so really, for there to be another revolutionary driver of revenue, not to overuse the word, it'd have to be like, what's that other device or other item that's going to be so just central in our lives that we'd be using it day in and day out for everything else. And you're like, well, and even if we knew what that device was, wouldn't that device just be a new version of the iPhone in some capacity?
Well, yeah, in a sense, that's true. I think that next device is smart glasses. Smart glasses are kind of an interesting hybrid. They probably will contain effectively the same computing power and connectivity as today's smartphone. But the main thing that they do is they provide you with a display medium that, subjectively at least, when you put the glasses on, looks like you're sitting in front of a large screen TV or monitor. And in addition, it's in stereo too, so it can actually do 3D type effects.
Well, and if sorry to interrupt, but like, if they can get smart glasses to function the way everyone would like them to function in the ways you're describing, that's what unleashes the power of AR and VR, augmented and virtual reality, which that would be huge.
Yeah, and I think it will be, and that's what they're working on, but they're not there yet. I mean, it just these kinds of things take a lot of years. They spent a lot of years on developing iPhone. They had a lot of research going on. Originally, the story is that they were really focused on a tablet, and then Jobs saw the research and saw what they were doing and said, "Well, can we shrink that tablet down to a handheld device?" And that became iPhone. So yeah, I think that is kind of the next big thing. I think it's a lot more promising than Apple Watch is, although I think Apple Watch is growing pretty healthily and is going to become more important. I think ultimately Apple Watch becomes everybody's standard, or smartwatches in general become the standard sort of communications device. Something that you always have, and you can receive calls and text anytime you want to.
Right. That's interesting. Because the thing about watches is, my understanding is that Apple is the only smartwatch that actually is doing well. Like a lot of them really struggling and not doing well. And I mean, I've got a Fitbit on my arm right now, which I like, but honestly, I've been thinking about.
They clobbered their competitors.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have the top market share, and the big advantage that they have is that for a compact device, you really the emphasis is on good hardware software integration, and they do it better than anybody else. I mean, Android Wear kind of beat them to market first, but the integration wasn't nearly as powerful. And then on top of it, the chipset sort of languished for a couple of years, where Qualcomm was the chipset maker. They didn't update the chipset, and it was only recently that they did that. So in the meantime, Apple has been coming out with new chipsets every year for Apple Watch, new designs, and then they introduced LTE last year, and that was a big boost to sales. So LTE connectivity, the next step is to completely make the watch independent. Right now, it's still kind of tethered to the iPhone. You need an iPhone in order to get LTE service for your Apple Watch, which is just kind of ridiculous, but it's sort of the way Apple contrives things. Even though the watch has a separate LTE radio and can be used independent of iPhone, you can't set it up unless you have an iPhone.
I mean, I wonder if part of that is battery life. I mean, is it able to kind of maybe it's able to preserve power a little bit that way? Because I've heard the LTE on the watch definitely draws a lot out.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's a good point. The battery life is very limited. I haven't read any good numbers on that, and Apple doesn't advertise what the battery life is when you're using it for extensive calling. But I'm sure it isn't equivalent to iPhone.
Right. Well, Mark, this has been fantastic as always. Before as we're wrapping up, obviously we could talk for a long time. And any final thoughts, things you want to hit on real quick before that maybe we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah. I just sort of a broad market perspective and perspective on Apple valuations right now. I think the market negativity is way overdone. I think it kind of started with the Bloomberg article, The Big Hack. I don't know if you heard of that. Where they were alleging that the Chinese had secretly inserted chips into servers that were being used by companies like Apple and Amazon Web Services. That came out in early October, and that kind of set the tone for the whole earnings season, and it was all just kind of downhill from there. Bloomberg especially, I feel, has been especially negative about Apple. They called they specifically referred to the Apple earnings report as a flop. How is 20% year-over-year growth a flop? I don't know. How do you
high standards?
They never bothered to even define or explain why they called it a flop, but it just made a good headline in Bloomberg. So I think the media take this quarter has been excessively negative, especially for what I call the new paradigm stocks, of which Apple is the premier example. And I have not been dissuaded in any way in terms of my investment thesis about Apple. I think Apple is still a very strong, reliable growth stock. Yes, I did suffer when the stock sold off and the price declined. My response has been generally to just buy, to take advantage of the price drop.
Awesome. Mark, hey, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for all the great work you do on Seeking Alpha.
Thank you.
The information and opinions contained on this podcast are for educational purposes only. The information does not consider the economic status or risk profile of any specific person. The information and opinions expressed should not be construed as investment trading advice and does not constitute an offer or an invitation to make an offer to buy and sell securities.